And one thing that we all want to bring to your attention is that recently a portion of the Gulf of Mexico, approximately the size of Italy, is up for auction. It's being auctioned off specifically for the purpose of drilling for oil. So there we have it, not just more, but even more and more offshore drilling rigs. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm your host today as we discuss exploitation in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Some of you may know that I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I spent a lot of my formative years in Galveston, Texas, which of course makes up the Gulf of Mexico. There were many things that I loved about Galveston. Well, for one thing, what child doesn't love going to the beach? But also the waters were very warm. And so you didn't have to shiver as you ran into the water. It was kind of like bath water. And for someone like me who doesn't like the cold, it was great. But it's not just that. The Gulf of Mexico and Galveston Bay is home to so many unique creatures. So many unique birds. There's the brown pelican, which I believe is on the endangered list. And there are many bottlenose dolphins, porpoises, so many beautiful sea creatures. So I had so much fun going on tour boats, seeing the dolphins play together. You know, the water off the Gulf of Mexico, where it's a bit deeper, is actually quite blue. I know that when you see it from the shore, it does kind of look like a sludgy brown, and it kind of is. And that's kind of where I want to take my topic off a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, the water was very warm. However, one could say almost too warm, and it's expected to get even warmer by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That's not very far off. And that's an extremely high curvature of warming. The animals that call the Galveston Bay home, they're not going to evolve quickly enough in order to become accustomed to the warming of this water. Some of the things that I found beautiful were, when I look at it, kind of amazing. I enjoyed sitting on the beach and looking at the Gulf shrimping boats out there in the ocean. Well, there were also oil rigs that you could see far offshore, especially in the night with their lights. And I found this to be very romantic. There were a lot of refineries, and there still are a lot of refineries up and down the Gulf. And I used to love driving home late at night and seeing the flaring of the methane or whatever gas there was. You could see the flames shooting out into the night sky, and I found that very poetic. I also remember that we had to carry baby lotion with us to the beach so that when we came out of the water, we could wipe the tar off of our bodies. There were indeed many tar stations, and probably still are tar stations along the Gulf. I know Corpus Christi has them, Galveston has them, and these are washing stations along the beach so that you can wash the tar off of you after you've swam. And of course, looking back, those romantic notions of seeing the offshore oil rigs, the lights out in the far, far distance, the flaring from the fossil fuel refineries into the air, into the night air that I found so beautiful as a child. I had no idea of the harm that they were causing. I had no idea that they would make a warm Gulf even warmer. That's what they were doing. I just thought it was normal for us to have tar on us when we came out of the water. And of course, now I know that this is not only not normal, but accepting this as normal, even normalizing it by having these tar cleaning stations is really, really harmful, because when you grow up with this and when that's all you know, it really does seem normal. It's anything but. If we have to wash tar off of ourselves, what does that say about the animals who are living in the Gulf itself? And I know that Peter has a lot of thoughts about this as well, and I want to turn it over to him and hear what he has to say.
Thanks, Regina. And yeah, I very much share, and from what I've read on it, I very much share your apprehension of the future. And I want to start this by introducing a paper I just read yesterday. The most unusual climate change paper is by psychologists, and they address the problem basically of we've known that the planet is being wrecked and degraded for 50 years or more. Everybody has known that. And yeah, why is nothing happening? And the Gulf of Mexico is a perfect example. There's plans, a Gulf of Mexico plan, like we've got a plan for everything. And we've had this plan for 10, 15, or 20 years, and absolutely nothing has happened. So it's very interesting because the psychologists looked at the research papers, looked at the media coverage, and they said, well, if you want to move people, if you want to have people get involved, you're doing exactly the wrong thing. And they went through all the wrong approaches that both the scientific papers and also the media share. And I certainly agree with them on the way that scientific papers are presented. And so the climate change is we've got several papers saying that climate change will make the situation in the Gulf of Mexico worse. The waters will warm, and they're warming right down the full depths of the Gulf of Mexico. The surface temperature of the Gulf of Mexico is warming at twice the rate of average of surface temperatures in similar situations. A very, very complicated paper that I waded through, but really that was the outcome of the whole paper. The dead zones are most particularly something that we in the public really have always been aware of just because of their name, right? We have two forms of dead zones now, and I'm not talking about the open ocean deep dead zones. I'm talking about the coasts and the estuaries and the bays. And those dead zones are all around the world. They've been mapped out. They cover 95,000 square miles now. In the past 50 years or so, the number of dead zones has increased tenfold. In the United States, the dead zones have increased 30-fold, with more than 300 so-called dead zones. And we're really talking here about coastal ecosystems. Yes, of course, obviously, we're worried about marine life and in the whole, but it's the coastal ecosystems that everybody's aware of. And we need those coastal ecosystems not only because of the richness of life, but because they're carbon stores, they're the original carbon capture device of Mother Nature. And they're already being degraded everywhere. The climate change with the increase in surface heating, but also the increase in precipitation, what the scientists call driving the hydrological cycle, that's going to make the whole situation of runoff, nitrogen pollution runoff, from the intense agriculture using the intense chemical nitrogen fertilizers. And that's the cause of the problem. And that runs off, so there'll be more precipitation. So we'll have more of the stuff running off into the Gulf of Mexico and into all these other dead zones. And it will simply make them worse. So, I have to ask myself, okay, I mean, like yourself, I've been sort of trying to do something about this for many decades. It's a little bit more than frustrating that at this time, just a few days ago, we hear the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres make a press presentation after the yet again failed Bonn pre-COP discussions, roadblocked. We're going to not do anything about climate change. It's going to continue to change. So to hear him say that fossil fuels are incompatible with humanity or human life, yeah, wow, good for him. Has that made any difference? No, not at all. Not at all. So I think we have to have a new narrative here. I think the psychologists are right. I don't think it's enough to just report the science. I think we have to report the science with something that we're trying to do, with some values, with some objectives, conclusions on the science. And the conclusions, of course, everywhere is that the products of science, our brilliant science and technology, are being used mainly to overexploit all of the resources and basically to trash the best places in the world and altogether to basically trash the planet. And we really, really need our scientists to at least say something in that regard, right? It's not enough for us to have all these papers. I mean, the number of scientific papers coming out on climate change is absolutely awesome, but it's not enough for them to reach a conclusion at the end of their paper that they don't know quite enough, so we need to do more research. And it's not enough for them to say, for example, in situations like the Gulf of Mexico, we have to do what we can to reduce the pollution and we have to do more conservation. We have to make an absolutely fundamental transformation to what we believe is the right way to live. And that really means bringing values into the narrative and drawing some conclusions that might be uncomfortable because it's us that's doing all this.
Thank you very much, Peter. I like what you had to say about the science is not enough. How many people have degrees in climate science? Not a lot. And even those who are interested in the science and know a little bit, for example, they understand albedo, jet stream, greenhouse gases. It's still, when scientists talk, I think sometimes they miss the heart, and I truly mean the heart of the matter. I feel as though it's really important to touch people on an emotional level because we're emotional beings, and most change in life is made because of our emotions, not necessarily just our thoughts. So I think that is so important. And if someone is not moved by the mass extinctions that are happening in the Gulf and will continue to happen, perhaps the fact that this warming and the fact that it will lead to more algal blooms and it will increase harmful bacteria in the waters that we enjoy and could be a detriment to human health, perhaps that may be a way of moving people, of reaching them, that, hey, you spent a lot of time in Galveston or Corpus Christi or Padre Island and you want to bring your kids there, but it may no longer be safe. I think that's a really big takeaway message. Also, a lot of people make their living in the Gulf of Mexico. I know further east of Texas, there's a lot of people, a lot of shrimpers who make their money in Louisiana. And it's how many people feed themselves and their families. And a lot of Vietnamese immigrants many years ago came to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico and the Texas-Louisiana border doing shrimping and have started small companies and have sent their kids to school because of that. And that's becoming harder and harder. So it's not just, and I put just in quotes, it's not just an environmental issue. It's not just an issue in terms of biomass, but it's also extremely integral to the economy of the entire Southwest, the entire southwestern part of this nation. So these are so many ways that we can reach people. And I hope we're reaching you out there who are watching this show. I hope that this is opening you up to a new way of thinking about the Gulf of Mexico, how critical it is to our nation or to the United States if you're not from the United States. And if it has, please go ahead and give us a like. And if you haven't done so yet, subscribe, because we want you to be with us every time we have a show. And I want to pass it on to Paul and hear what he has to say. Paul?
Yes, thank you. Galveston is quite famous for the big storm that they had. That was well before your time, over 110 years ago, when the storm surge from a hurricane basically submerged the island and caused huge loss of life. One of the biggest disasters, I think, in U.S. history. And that was before we had the ability to accurately predict these storms. I mean, it wouldn't happen today because there'd be massive evacuations. But, this is a region, the Gulf of Mexico is a region that has these large hurricanes. And it seems that the more intense and the stronger and the larger and the more severe top category hurricanes are amplified by the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And because the jet streams have slowed, they're often not moving as quickly as they used to. So remember a few years ago, there was one that was moving about a mile an hour off the coast of Texas and caused tremendous damage. So, the Gulf's not just climate change, it's been stressed by humans for a long period of time. The offshore drilling started in 1942. Over the years, over 6,000 structures, oil and gas structures, have been installed in the Gulf. There's about 3,500 of them there now, of which 3,200 are active. And of course, a lot of these oil rigs are interconnected by pipelines, and the pipelines leak, or if you get a massive blowout, as we had in 2010 with the Deepwater Horizon, the horrible oil spill then. It's something that's been going on in the Gulf for a long time. And Regina, you mentioned having to wash tar off your bodies from swimming. I don't know if I'd swim in the first place if I got covered in tar, but if you're down there and it's so hot, you want to go in the water. So, the Gulf of Mexico is kind of a focal point for the runoff of nutrients from a large part of the US, because the Mississippi watershed drains about 41% of the US by area. People's lawns, what they fertilize them with, sewage plants, fertilizers and pesticides on farmland, all of those things. When there's heavy rainfall, those nutrients, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus, get washed into the rivers, the tributaries and rivers, and they get concentrated and carried by the Mississippi down into the Gulf of Mexico. And, where they cause the nutrients cause these blooms of algae. And of course, there's just too much algae. The algae decomposes and dies and sinks to the bottom. And when it's broken down by bacteria, it uses up all the oxygen down below, and that is responsible for many, many fish kills and these huge dead zones. It's sort of like an annual event. After the snow melts and there's heavy rains in the spring, there's a huge rush of nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico. It causes these areas of the ocean that just don't have enough dissolved oxygen to support fish. So there's all of these things going on. And also the water temperatures rising as much as they are strengthens hurricanes. Anything over 26.5 degrees Celsius water temperature actually reinforces the strength of the hurricanes. So this is another big issue, but at least the hurricanes mix a lot of the water. So, the dead zones vary in size from year to year, depending on winds and also number of hurricanes, because there is mixing of oxygen into the water when there's higher winds and when there's a hurricane passing through. So that can help try to reduce the dead zone size. So there is a group, the Nature Conservancy is doing a lot of work with farmers to have them have more efficient use of pesticides, less use of pesticides and fertilizers. They also work at restoring wetlands, and the restoration of wetlands means that the floodwaters, the waters from the torrential rains have a place to soak into the ground, and that can reduce some of the nutrients. They can settle out. So there is some work being done. I mean, it's kind of a work in progress. It's all of these different factors are affecting this region.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought up the great storm in Galveston. And of course, you and I have talked about that book that we both love so much, Ian's Storm. We'll put the link in the description, which describes that terrible, frightening storm. Of course, this is an area with a lot of storms, I just remember a lot of flash floods growing up, tremendous outpouring of rain. But that also brings to mind that Galveston is pretty much a barrier island, and it's in a very precarious position because of that. Yes, it's huge. Well, in terms of barrier islands, a lot has been built on it, but it's, I guess you could liken it to a giant sandbar, and therein lies the precarity. There is a giant medical center that's on Galveston. There's a great tourist area on Galveston, lots of hotels, lots of restaurants. I don't know how many more storms it can handle. And honestly, with the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic, and the ensuing sea level rise. It brings a great threat of coastal erosion. So there are many, many things that sadly lie in Galveston's wake. And I have to say the same about Padre Island. Padre Island, too, to the southern part of Texas, is a beautiful island, but it's right at sea level. And I don't know how much sea level rise these areas can take. And with that, I want to hear some more from Peter.
Yeah, we talked about the coastal degradation and ecosystems, and if you look at a map, and we've had these maps forever on global coastal dead zones, the east coast of the United States is practically all dead zones. Dot, 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 dot. There's a lot on the west coast, but the United States of America has by far and away the most dead zones in the world. Of course, there are many around Europe as well, and there's a few around China, a few around Australia. They are a global problem. Now, the dead zones are increasing exponentially. We always have to be sort of careful when we say exponential, because sometimes a thing increases very fast and it levels off, then it increases very fast again, like we're seeing with methane. But there is no question on global dead zones that they're increasing at an exponential rate. So as I say, we talked about the problem is a problem that comes to the surface, as Paul explained for us nicely. It's an agricultural problem. That's the problem, right? It's the nitrogen chemical, the pure nitrogen fertilizer that's used, which is a nutrient which flows into the coasts and estuaries, and in this case, into the Gulf of Mexico. The dead zones occur on the bottom. There's a chain of feeding on the nutrients, algae, zooplankton, and then they decay, go to the bottom of the water, and there the bacteria proliferate, and they go to town and they deplete the oxygen. That's how it works. But it all comes down to the fact that we need to change our agriculture. Now, we've known that we need to change our agriculture for decades and decades and decades, obviously. There's a lot more awareness of that, I think, that the transformation of agriculture away from chemicals, away from pesticides, back to more traditional methods of agriculture. But this transformation has to be carefully managed, and it has to be done at a fairly slow pace, in fact. And of course, we sort of have no time. I want to close with reflecting on the fact that the United States government administration has increased by a very substantial number the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. That is very problematic because the fact is, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, we have to close down the fossil fuel industry. If we don't, we're closed down, right? It's either them or us. The science confirms that. It's confirmed it for years and years. The sixth assessment of the IPCC, for the first time, definitely confirmed that, in so much as we have to put global emissions of carbon, CO2, and methane in particular on immediate and rapid decline, so that before mid-century, the scientists do say, they have published, that there can be no fossil fuel industry anymore. So when we hear that there's going to be more exploitation, more development, we're talking over exploitation, we do have to react to that, because it's the people in the long run that are going to have to pressure the governments and corporations to bring us on the next phase of energy, which of course is the global age of clean, renewable energy, which would be the best life that we've ever imagined. But to do that, we have to survive. And to survive, we have to get the fossil fuel industry entirety, natural gas, all of them, to close down.
Thank you, Peter, for repeating that ever important drumbeat. We need to end fossil fuel subsidies and use as absolutely soon as possible, preferably yesterday. And the idea of increasing the amount of oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, makes me incredibly sad. We all remember, as you mentioned, Deepwater Horizon and Paul as well. And how many more of these can the Gulf survive? Do we even have to ask? So, Paul, I would like to hear some closing thoughts from you regarding the specific nature of the Gulf of Mexico. And as Peter mentioned, if you wanted to talk about anything regarding increasing the oil rigs out there in the Gulf.
Yes. So first want to mention that the Gulf of Mexico is vital for seafood. The U.S. It's over 40% of the U.S. seafood supply. And I think Louisiana is right up there as a state producing, among the most seafood of all the states. I think it's just beaten out by Alaska. And these dead zones, NOAA's estimated that the dead zone costs basically something like, $82 million a year of loss in seafood and tourism. And it's not just less seafood, but it's really the quality of the seafood. I mean, is the seafood fit for consumption? I mean, I think regular testing has to be done to make sure there's not contamination from mostly the oil industry. Also, we haven't mentioned the red tides, which do kill a number of the fish occasionally in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's from microorganisms directly killing the fish. And then, of course, there's we've talked about the anoxia, or the lack of oxygen, the dead zones, but also the increasing water temperature is a big factor. And yes, the Gulf of Mexico is fairly shallow near the coastline. It gets deeper a bit further out. So these offshore structures, some of them are in water as shallow as like 10 feet or so, whereas other ones go right out into the deep part of the Gulf and go down quite, quite deep depths anyway. They're doing deep water drilling. The Deepwater Horizon was named for the deep water, and of course that's the one that there was catastrophic failure of in 2010. And it seemed to take them forever to cap that well. Another question is how, companies are all eager to go and drill the wells, but when it comes to capping them, when they reach the end of their lifetime, you need to remove the steel structures that they call it idle iron, right? You need to actually physically cap the well, and then I think they have to go down deep into the mud and sever the metal piping of the well. And there's always some leakage when they're doing that process. I mean, there's always leakage from these structures, even if they're not active. So there's and they're dotted all around the Gulf. So when there's a large superstorm or hurricane coming, they often have to evacuate entire regions of oil rigs. Can also be stress on the rigs and the pipelines from connecting the rigs, interconnecting the rigs from these huge storms, which can then lead to higher risks of problems. And also methane, a lot of methane coming off when you're extracting this oil from under the seabed. There's methane within the oil, which is flared off generally, or some of it is just released into the atmosphere. And there's been issues with helicopter crashes as they approach rigs to land on them. They have to be upwind of the rigs, because if they're downwind and they go into a methane cloud, it can cut out their engines and cause crashes. So this has been a problem that has been occurring for many, many years, and it's still happening, basically.
Paul mentioned methane. There's a lot more methane coming across these platforms in the Gulf of Mexico than anybody realized. So a paper was published this April. They're looking at double the amount of methane from these operations. So it's pretty big.
Another threat to the Gulf of Mexico, erosion plays a big factor in the land that adjoins the Gulf. As I mentioned, Galveston is a barrier island Padre Island, South Padre Island, that too is a barrier island. Much of this coastal region is not too far above sea level at all. And so there's a great deal of threat that these regions face due to the melting of the ice caps. And of course, we have to add in that our good friend, thermal expansion. As we know, when water warms, it expands, at the molecular level. So we have two things working against not only the Gulf of Mexico, but the land adjoining the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, we've talked about the sea level rise, how that's making things worse in the Gulf of Mexico, but also to remember that places where the Mississippi River enters the Gulf of Mexico, the river, of course, is carrying huge amounts of sediment, and that sediment settles in the delta where the Mississippi joins the Gulf of Mexico, and all that additional weight is causing subsidence. So it's causing the land actually to sink lower and lower. This is a huge problem in some places like New Orleans, for example, but it also means that the rate of sea level rise along the coastlines in the Gulf of Mexico is quite a bit larger than the global average rate of sea level rise. So this is another factor that's important.
Thank you so much, Paul, for covering all of those bases. And of course, thank you as always to you too as well, Peter. And thank you especially to you, our audience. And one thing that we all want to bring to your attention is that recently a portion of the Gulf of Mexico, approximately the size of Italy, is up for auction. It's being auctioned off specifically for the purpose of drilling for oil. So there we have it. Not just more, but even more and more offshore drilling rigs. So, maybe we'll just drill our way into having this giant oil pit that we call the Gulf of Mexico. Who knows what the future may hold, but at least we'll be able to fill our cars, right? We really just have to allow for this understanding that there is a lot going on that is putting us in a really bad way, putting the planet and everyone who depends on the planet in dire jeopardy. So please, everyone, stay strong, continue to fight the good fight, and we'll see you the next time at the next Climate Emergency Forum.